Hello everyone, thank you so much for joining us today for our Colloquium series. It is my pleasure to introduce our guest, Dr. Paul Kockelman. Dr. Kockelman comes to us from Yale University, where he is professor in the Department of Anthropology. Dr. Kockelman is a linguistic anthropologist who has conducted extensive ethnographics and linguistic fieldwork among speakers of Maya. Through the analysis of language and culture, Dr. Kockelman's research explores and expands the connections between semiotics and a variety of topics such as agency, subjectivity, labor, measurement, causality, inference, economy, ecology, materiality, and objectivity, among others. His current research focuses on the relation between gradients, grading, degradation, and grace. Dr. Kockelman is the author of multiple monographs. His forthcoming monograph, Kinds of Value, an experiment in model anthropology, provides linguistic and ethnographic-based analysis of value and its interpretation. His most recent book, The Art of Interpretation in the Age of Computation, provides an insightful reading of various theoretical faculties in interpreting the computer age through the lens of semiotics. He's also the author of Chicken and the Kettle, Portable Values and Incommensurate Ontologies in Guatemala's Cloud Forest, Language, Culture and Mind, Nature Constructions and Social Kinds, and the Agent, Person, Subject, Self, a theory on ontology, interaction, and infrastructure. Dr. Kockelman's talk today brings his insight into language and culture to the interpretation of food, titled Still Too Sweet, on the thresholds of time and intensity. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Paul Kockelman.
Well, thank you all so much for coming today and for the invitation, coming to talk in the first place. I really appreciate it. So what I'm going to be talking about today are words like very, a lot, and a little, which I'll refer to as indefinite quantities.
Can we make you either speak a little louder or use the microphone? It's a big room. Stuff kind of disappears into it.
Which I will refer to as indefinite quantities. Better? Okay. And by indefinite quantities, I don't mean anything too deep. I just kind of mean them in contrast to what you might call definite quantities, things like 2 and 3 and 5 dozen. Okay. I'm also interested in the relationship between those indefinite quantities and these modal indefinite quantities, words like enough, over, and to. And by modal, I don't mean anything too deep by it either, but you might think of the modal auxiliary verbs in English. Words like may and can and should and could and would. So these are, in some sense, these little particles are like the indefinite quantities, but they bring modality in with them. And then finally, I'm interested in these 3 or 4 little adverbs, still, no longer, not yet, and already. And I'll just call them phase-altering adverbs for the moment. Okay? And I'm going to look at these words in relationship to food or energy more generally, and waste or entropy and degradation more generally. Okay. And as Yale mentioned, so I work with speakers of Quechua, a Mayan language spoken by about 1 million people in Guatemala, Belize, a little bit Mexico, and the United States. And most of the data I'll be using today will come from work, spanning about 25 years with speakers of that language. Some of it going back to 1999, and some of it from 2018. Okay, so let me see. Okay. So this first expression, this is from fieldwork in 1999, and this is just kind of came up in the midst of an interview with a woman speaking about the kinds of taboos that constrain a woman's behavior in the context of either being pregnant or in the context of her hens brooding. And there are these kind of very interesting, sympathetic magic or iconic indexical relations between the behavior of women and how that may causally affect the health of the chicks once they hatch. And what I've done here, I'm going to have to yell this out, but I've kind of arranged this. As you can see, there's a kind of very, very nice kind of inverted analogy between her covering the brooding hens with a basket, the brooding chicken, and then when the chicks will hatch later, them breaking forth from their shells. And then simultaneously, there's a very nice parallel between her going for a walk when her hens are covered, and then the chickens walking very far away from home once they've hatched. And in some sense, the logic behind this taboo is you should not walk very far when your hen is brooding, or else the chicks, once they hatch, will kind of engage in this far distance behavior. They'll wander very far from the homestead, and as a function of that, they'll be very easy prey for the chicken hawk. Okay, so the kind of whole key thing here is that, in some sense, a woman shouldn't go too far, or else her chicks will too. Okay, and there's this kind of organizational logic. That pun doesn't work in Kekchi, because the two senses of too much, and he did it and I did it too, they're not aligned in Kekchi, but they are in English. But it's a nice pun anyway, so I have to go with it. So a couple things to note here. One, just in respect to that notion of modality, this has no modal operators in it, but the whole notion of taboo is in some sense a modal operator. This is a type of behavior you cannot do or should not do. So one thing to note. The second thing to note is that in some sense, the chicks are accountable for the behavior of the hen's owner, right? They in some sense suffer the consequences of the actions undertaken by the woman. And then a third thing to note is that the kind of key thing here is one of these little indefinite quantities, very, which is modifying a little adverb far, which is modifying a little verbal predicate to go. And I think the kind of key thing here, one thing you might notice is mas itself is actually a loan word from Spanish, right? So you think of mas versus menos in Spanish, but in Spanish it means more as opposed to less. In Kekchi, where it kind of came into Kekchi historically about 140 years ago, it basically means the equivalent of muy, very, or mucho, muchos, these sorts of things, much or many. So in some sense, though it was brought into Kekchi, it kind of did a pretty wild transformation with respect to what it means. Instead of indicating something like direction, it came to indicate something like magnitude. And then the last thing to note when we kind of focus on this example is that in some sense, chicks, and when they become big, chickens are in some sense a key source of food for women as well as chicken hawks, right? So in some sense you have here a single kind of value of interest to members of two species, and kind of establishing a social relationship between chicken hawks and women. And the key thing women want to do is in some sense they want to control the death of the chick. It's up to them rather than the chicken hawk. And so they spend no amount of care invested in chicks, in part to stave off these attacks as long as possible. Okay. We'll come back to chickens and hawks actually quite soon. So here's another example. So this was field work in 2018, and this was a man telling me about something that he had overheard. It was kind of lately in the news. And he said, Kawa Trump kisje, Trump said, Lain kwan hunin boton cha. I have a button, he said. Mas nim kwe. So there's that little indefinite quantity again. Mine is very big. Tin pit. Uteshin come see. I will press it and I will kill you all. So plural form. Okay. Lihun chi kisje. This is the leader of North Korea. Lain kwan hun ahui. Lain kwan ahui hun likwe. Hual nin kechiru la kwe. Tin pits. Tatin come see. So the other one said, I too have a button. Mine is very, very big in comparison to yours. I will press it and I will kill you in the singular. So just meaning you, Donald Trump. Okay, so this is the man reporting the gist of a much publicized conversation between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un regarding nuclear missiles. A couple things to note about it. One, Trump kind of described his missile launching button as, well, I'll go back up, sorry. In some sense, what Trump is using here at least according to the man, is an implicit comparative construction. He's saying my button is very big in comparison to the average button, right? And when Kim Jong-un comes along and says, I too have a button, mine is very big in comparison to yours. So this is an explicit comparative construction. And now the comparative ground is not the size of a typical button, it's the size of Donald Trump's button. And the magnitude has in some sense been doubled from mas, meaning very, to hua, meaning very. In a longer essay, I tell you something about the history of this word. This word is actually, 500 years ago, this wasn't an alienable possession in Kekchi that meant leader. Okay? Our leader. In the same class of words that things like shadows, names, hearts, body parts, and kinship relations is in. But slowly over time it got abstracted in its meaning and it became to mean kind of strength per se, and then just came to be used as a general intensifier to mean very. So it's somewhat ironic in the context of who's using it. We just wanted to know kind of the separate genealogy of Hual as opposed to Mas in this language, and yet they're both in some sense have similar functions. So just as a tiny bit of abstraction, I just kind of want to note the certain key things when you think about these implicit comparisons, like my button is very big, there's some dimension, in this case it's size. There's a figure, the size of Trump's button, kind of somewhere along that dimension with a certain degree of that dimension. There's a ground, the size of the typical button that figure is being compared to. And then there's a direction, in this case a kind of implicit greater than, and a magnitude vary, right? So these, in some sense, these indefinite quantities have a kind of vectoral character, okay? If you had to gloss their meaning in kind of rough semantics, you might say something like, my button is large to a certain degree. That degree exceeds a certain implicit comparative ground or threshold by a certain magnitude. And that threshold is dependent on the size, the figure, and various other aspects of context, the stancing, speakers, identities between the participants, the world in which they find themselves, and so forth. Okay, not a big deal, but when we go to think about modal indefinite quantities, we want to contrast their meaning with these. And so kind of one thing that's sort of crucial here about the kind of shifting nature of these indefinite quantities is that unlike definite quantities, when you say something like big, as in big for a button, big for a button is very different than big for a book or big for a car or big for a star, right? So they have a very kind of elastic quantity in that sense. And so very loosely speaking, when you say something is big, you mean it's bigger than the average button, okay? But that construction didn't just have a big in it, it had a very big. When you say very big for a button, it also has a kind of elastic quality. And so very loosely, you can think of it as something like bigger than the average plus the standard deviation for the set thing. And I say that absolutely tongue-in-cheek. Don't get wrong with that. Okay? But what I mean is, in some sense, here you're comparing a button with all buttons and saying it's big. Here you're comparing a button with big buttons and saying it's big with big buttons. Okay? But you do want to note the relationship to these indefinite quantities are in some sense related to notions of norms, notions of statistics, and so forth, or it can be. Okay? Okay, so now, just to kind of look at that relationship for a second here, right? We had that one man articulating in some sense a conversation between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un, and as it was articulated, Trump says this, my button is very big, as a kind of sign, and Kim Jong-un comes along and says, my button is hua, bigger than your button, as a kind of interpretant or response to that sign. Very simple thing. And that's one single sign. The object of that sign and that interpretant was in some sense a little comparative situation like this. Here's that dimension, the size of buttons. Here's Trump's button, which is bigger than average. But then Kim Jong-un comes along and he basically stacks his on top of Trump's and says, well, it's bigger than average, mine's bigger than Trump's by a lot rather than just a mas. Okay? It's a fun little thing to think about. But you have to go back to a definition of value as we might get from Aristotle or Marx, something like relationship between people mediated by a relationship between things. Here we have in some sense a relationship between agents, in particular a signer and an interpreter, mediated by the relationship between a sign and an interpreter. And so that in some sense figures their social relation in a very particular way, and it kind of looks like that. With in some sense the dimension shifting to something like potency and Kim Jong-un being stacked on top of Trump in that sort of way. Now there are Freudian things you can do with this and much else besides, but I don't have that kind of clearance yet. Okay. So enough of that. So I want to do with these next two examples is just give you some sense of the elasticity and context dependence of these indefinite grounds. So here's a person talking about roosters now, two roosters fighting. It goes perfectly with the Trump and Kim, needless to say. Okay, so, na mas na vale, qui quanta ipo la hoshit lizo kashlan, mas neketik. Okay, so here's a crucial thing: is mas is an indefinite quantity, and na is also an indefinite quantity. And mas is in some sense the widest scope of the indefinite quantities. It can have scope not just over adjectives, but also over other indefinite quantities. Okay. And in this case, the kind of crucial thing is that when you're talking about roosters in this village, very many mas na valet can correspond to basically 2 or 3. Okay, so when the figure that you're talking about is something like a rooster, very many is simply 2 or 3. Now, if we go to chicks, that same expression, and then after this indefinite quantity, they give in some sense a modalized quantity. Perhaps some 50 chicks died. So this is a very simple point, but to note that masnabal in its indefinite quantityness can map onto a number like 2 or 3 when you're talking about roosters, or map onto a number like 50 when you're talking about chicks. Okay, just a simple point, but I kind of want to put it up there. Note the other thing is in both of these expressions, you get an indefinite quantity co-occurring with a definite quantity that in some sense is referring to the same quantity, the same thing in the world, the same amount. And so this is in some sense, and they oftentimes come with these little things like perhaps and so forth. So the definite quantity with something like a perhaps is kind of set up as parallel to the indefinite quantity. So even though I'm going to be talking about modal indefinite quantities later on, it should be realized that oftentimes indefinite quantities per se are modalized, right? There is some epistemic uncertainty, right, precisely about this indefinite quantity, and hence when you go to gloss it in the next phrase, you can put something like a perhaps there, you're uncertain about it. Okay. So it's more food talk. So here's someone in some sense telling you this was more about food taboos and sort of what sorts of desires get stoked in you in cases of pregnancy or in cases of certain sorts of sickness. And someone said, in one of these contexts, I would really like a certain kind of food. And in the very next line, they in some sense offer a paraphrase of what they just said, posea, in other words, in other words, I would very, very much like the food. And I just want to put this up for you, so just so you realize that, in some sense, just like you can compare indefinite quantities using words like mas and qual, speakers oftentimes compare the magnitude encoded by words like qual and mas. Right? So here we're getting, in some sense, we're not just talking about how much you want something, but we're getting a nice kind of comparison of how many masses equals one qual, as it were. And hence, that's one of the reasons I was saying, mas has a magnitude yay big, and which is very indefinite, to be sure. But qual is in some sense bigger than that by a certain amount. Just a few more kind of instances of food talk, and just a few more definite quantities before we move on. So El Gallo is the name of the kind of national beer, kind of means rooster. So El Gallo mas un tap tap. So very quickly you become drunk or buzzed. I know why I like this, other than we kind of chickens to roosters. But the nice thing here is you've got an interjection functioning as a verb, with tense and person morphology attached to it. Here's another one. I don't have a lot of money to buy high quality dog food. In this case, it was functioning as an understatement. This man didn't have a lot of money at all. Okay, so now I kind of want to slowly start moving into those modal indefinite quantities. And to do that, I want to use an expression where you have a kind of a token of both an indefinite quantity and modal indefinite quality occurring together in parallel. And so what you have here is, in some sense, Maya, ke. In May, there's coldness enough, or it's sufficiently cold, it's pretty cold. Anahuan, ke. But now, in January, it is very, very cold. So here you have a kind of parallelism set up between 2 points in time, right? There's now, which was January at the time, versus May. There's a kind of interjection indicating different degrees of intensity. This has a much higher intensity usually than that, which this one just oftentimes functions as a floor holder. You have these two indefinite quantities, one modal and one not, both talking about the degree of coldness during that time period. So this word sa'al, which I'm translating as sufficient or enough. So one thing to note about it, because we're going to spend some time kind of talking about it, first thing to note about it is it's an abstraction from the word for price. Okay, so if you ask what the price of something is, you say, how much is its cost? If you take that noun, which means price, and you add some kind of morphology to it, you get a kind of adjective that means something like sufficient. Okay, so in some sense, and you oftentimes get both price and sufficiency in the same construction. So you'll have someone say, I didn't have enough money to buy it. And so you get the tzakal, enough, and the tzak, money, in one and the same sentence. I don't want to kind of engage in any speculation about what that means between thinking about price and sufficiency or enoughness for the moment, but just note that kind of relation there. We can kind of come back to it if you want. But another kind of really crucial thing here is that tzakal is inherently modal. It doesn't just indicate that the degree of some dimension is large or small. It often indicates that the degree of some dimension is sufficient for some action to be possible or some condition to be met. And so in that sense, it can refer to degrees that would be classed as both a lot and a little. Okay, and I'll give you some examples of that. So for example, you can say something with tzakal, I want to say basically claim it's decoupled from magnitude per se, even though it's kind of very interested in degree. And the idea is you can say something like it's not cold enough, even though it's incredibly cold, right? Or the opposite, right? It is cold enough, even though it's not very cold at all. Okay, this is what I mean by decoupled from magnitude. And similarly for their word for two, in the sense that I ate too much or it was too hot to handle, noon. It is too cold to engage in some action, let's say, even though it isn't very cold at all, right? Or it's not too cold, even though it's incredibly cold. Okay, so we want to get at like what's the nature of the semantics underlying this enough and this too, such that they're like these other indefinite quantities, but decoupled from them per se. Okay, and that's what we're going to spend some time on talking about now, before we move into time. Just to give you one nice example again involving food. I don't work on food at all, by the way, so I don't know why I was calling it this colloquium. But I just went through my transcripts and I said, let's pull out all the stuff where people talk about food. And I guess it turned out, who would have thought they talk about food a lot. So there was lots of data. Okay, so Achui Lishul Nakbalul Re. Mare Litzok, Mare Lipich. Marek Chehech, Marek Halau, Marek Yak, Marek Chicheak, Mutachinach Bishulavi. So also the wild animals do it. That is to say, they eat the family's milpa or cornfields. Perhaps the grackle, perhaps the woodpecker, perhaps the shara, perhaps the paca, perhaps the fox, perhaps the wild pig. There are too many wild animals in the sense of pests or predators around here. Okay. So this is, in some sense, that little verb I was giving you, that word I was giving you before, num, enough, in its participle form. It's in its participle form because num tak means to surpass or exceed. Okay? And the form num on which it is based used to be a productive modifier. It meant something like English to or over. So for example, you can say things, you can still say some of these like numatsam, over salted, shinum ko'ak, I overate, and so on. And we'll talk about exactly what does it mean to over something as opposed to under it. And then finally, this predicate in a different derivation, but in some sense used to be the key part of the colonial comparative construction. So when you do this, numet means to be passed, and ben means something like above. So instead of saying, my button is bigger than your button, I would have said something like, my button passes over your button by a certain amount or just a lot. And so in some sense, my button surpasses your button. So just note the notion here between surpass, excess, move over, over, and or to. And now, what we'll be interested in talking about is in some sense how those notions of enough and to interact with those temporal forms. And then here's three kinds of constructions you find where they co-occur. Okay? I think they all have to do with food as well. Toch numatsam likalt in kanda ruruk bad. The soup is still too salty or over-salted. It cannot be drowned. So here you get a kind of modal indefinite quantity occurring with one of those aspectual forms, still. Okay? You also get it occurring explicitly with, in some sense, a modal operator, the verb naru, which means both not able to, like you're not able to, and in some sense may not, you may not do it, you're not permitted to do it. So these two senses of modality. By the time I had arrived, he had already over-imbibed or drunk too much. So here you get that over construction occurring with one of these little temporal adverbs already. And then, we did not yet have enough money for the cow. And so here, another one of those aspectual forms, mahi, showing up with sakal. So now, we're basically going to talk about the semantics of these forms with a little bit more care, show how they're very similar to the semantics of these forms, and then show, in some sense, this kind of very interesting 4x4 grid of possibility space, in which judgments take a member of each of these two categories and co-occur, and in some sense talk about time and intensity at the same time. And we're going to use that to talk in some sense about certain forms of environmental degradation, moving in some sense from food or energy to entropy, loosely speaking. So in some sense we've hit the second half of the talk. Okay. Okay, so let me just move to English now for the rest of the talk until we come back to Kepchi at the end. So if we talk about something like too sweet, one way to kind of loosely gloss it is to say that the degree of sweetness for something that we're talking about is outside of an acceptable range, and in particular, it's on the high side of the acceptable range. So this little green line here, my apologies for the color, is just taking this as a dimension with various degrees along it. In some sense, there are these two thresholds. If you pass it, it becomes too much. If you haven't passed it, you're kind of not too much. If you pass this lower threshold, you're enough. If you haven't passed it, you're not enough. And so there's this crucial thing. This part is in some sense an acceptability range. And what these forms are in some sense sensitive to are these acceptability ranges. So not sweet enough means the degree of sweetness is outside of the acceptable range, but on the low side. It's down here, rather than on the high side. Not too sweet is the degree of sweetness is within the acceptable range, but on the high side. And sweet enough means that the degree of sweetness is within the acceptable range, but on the low side. Okay. And one thing that's kind of interesting about this and kind of worth thinking about is note I'm taking those modal indefinite quantities to and enough, but I'm also bringing a negation. Okay, that's why we all of a sudden bumped up to 4 categories rather than 2. The next thing to note is that an expression like not too expensive can be loosely glossed as kind of semantically very similar to something like cheap enough. Okay, what I did here is I just took the antonym of the adjective and removed the negation and then put in the opposite operator and left rather than 2, and I got a semantic equivalence. And vice versa, and similarly here, right, you can take something like not sweet enough and turn it into too sour. You just change the adjective to its negation and pull out the negation. So these are semantically speaking, these are something called a dual group because they exhibit this kind of very interesting behavior under negation and double negation in particular. Other forms that have very similar semantics, kind of at an abstract level, are logical operators like there exists and for all. So for example, if I say all children like ice cream, that is semantically similar to, and not identical with, there is no child who doesn't like ice cream. Okay? So we want to say, oh my gosh, even though these are very particular and have very kind of interesting relations to acceptability ranges, they also partake of this kind of very interesting, somewhat deep semantic structure. And we're going to see that those temporal spectral particles have the exact same structure from a certain degree. Okay. So now if we went to gloss these, this is kind of a first stab at these things. So if I want to say something like the car or the cow is too expensive to buy, you mean something like, right, the car is expensive to a certain degree. That degree exceeds a certain threshold or ground, which is itself dependent on the dimension, right? Here we're talking about expensiveness, but it could be something like coldness and so forth. The figure, we're talking about cars and the expensiveness of cars, not the expensiveness of pencils or pens or so forth. And it also turns on various other aspects of context, the stance of the speaker, the identities of and or relations between the participants. You can think about, how their incomes, so on and so forth, the situation in which they find themselves, all these features of context, and then various norms, ideals, models, rules, or regularities that are pertinent in that world, and so forth. So the key thing is to first start off by thinking then is that at this level, a modal indefinite quantity like 2 is very similar to one of those normal indefinite quantities. The semantics is so far relatively similar. There's a certain kind of content-dependent meaning and a certain kind of context-dependent meaning. Okay? Content-dependent means like we care about what adjective the predicate has scope, the word has scope over, and or what noun that predicate applies to. That's what I mean by content-dependent. And this is kind of context dependence. But then, crucially, when you get to these modal indefinite quantities, you add in some sense a rider that says because of such an excess, in the context of these kinds of projected regularities, the car cannot be bought. That is to say, one does not have enough money to buy it. Or perhaps it may not be bought. That is to say, one is not permitted to buy it. It should not be bought. That's to say, it would be unwise or undesirable to buy it. And or is unlikely to be bought. That is, it's not probable that people would buy it for that price. So again, you want to say that in some sense, these have a kind of modality built into them, but which particular species of modality, the epistemic, the deontic, the dynamic, to just attach big words to what I just said already. Something like cannot versus may not versus is unlikely to, depending on context, one of those or maybe one or more of those may come into force. Okay? So this is what I mean by the modal nature of these indefinite quantities. They very fundamentally turn on something like a modality, that which binds, norms, laws, capacities, epistemic senses of what's possible or probable, and so forth. Now, interestingly, given the semantics of these things, if you said something like the car is cheap enough to buy, you'd have a very, in some sense, similar sort of semantics, except that you pull out this negation. Okay. Okay, so now I want to turn to the interaction of indefinite modal quantities and those temporal adverbs. Okay? So here are the kinds of utterances I'm interested in, just for the sake of this talk, but in the sense of, at the end of July, there was no longer enough food for all the people. Despite the evidence they had seen, they were not yet angry enough to take a stand. When they finally began to act, it was already too damaged to make a difference. So again, I just have three little utterances, all in parallel, that you should have gotten used to by now. In some sense, they're almost identical utterances from the standpoint of grammatical categories, but they have very, very different contents, each of them. And so what I've done here for you is, in some sense, in each of them, I've underlined the temporal adverbs, a no longer, a not yet, and already. And I've bolded the other things, the modal indefinite quantities, the enough, the to. Okay? And so, as I mentioned before, I'm interested in some sense the interaction of these two sets of categories, these aspectual temporal categories and these indefinite modal categories. So before I talk about how they interact here, I just want to spend a little bit of time on what these guys mean. To talk about them, I have to just introduce a tiny bit of technical language. It's not that, though. I think you probably already heard it, but let me just say, I'm going to talk about things like speech events, right, the time in which the utterance was made. I'm going to talk about what we could call a narrated event, the time that it was already too damaged to make a difference. I'm just focusing on the third clause, sorry. I just want to focus on the third clause for a second. So in this case, I'm calling the narrated event, in some sense, the time of the second clause. Okay? The reference event is, in some sense, the time of this first clause, which sets the timing for the second clause. Okay, so you have three events in some sense. They don't have to be at the same points in time. They can be absolutely separated. The time I'm talking, the time when we finally began to act, and the time when it was too damaged to make a difference. You can call them whatever you want, salt, pepper, and ketchup. It doesn't matter. But the idea is that they're three separate ones. Okay? For the sake of these categories, you do not need to worry about the speech event. The speech event, they don't really care about the speech event per se. So just push that out of your minds for a second. And just focus on the relationship between the referent event and the narrative event. So here, with those two events in mind, I tried to kind of gloss already, still, not yet, and no longer for you. And the key idea is that already does something like, it says that the onset of the narrative event is before the reference event. That is to say, the beginning of this event occurred before this event. Okay, and I'm just giving you a little kind of diagram of it. If you think of the slash as the reference event, when we finally began to act, and you think of this, in some sense, as a narrated event, and that's just marking the beginning of the narrated event, it just says, look, the beginning of the narrated event was before the reference event. Okay? Then something like not yet is, in some sense, just simply says the onset of the narrated event is after the reference event. Right? It just basically shoves this little line this way. Okay? And then still, basically, instead of focusing on the beginning of the narrated event, or the onset of the narrated event, it focuses on the offset of the narrated event. And it says, at the time of the reference event, slash, the offset of the narrated event had yet to come in some sense, or is after the reference event. And no longer just shifts that thing again. It says, in some sense, at the time of the reference event, the end of the narrated event had already occurred. That's all these things do in this sense. They're much more complicated than this. And you might start imagining that for the sake of this talk, this is a kind of one key function of that. And just to give you another example of a reference event that's maybe kind of easier to think through, if I say something like, when I arrived at the house, that's the reference event. Boom, I arrived. He was still no longer, not yet, or already drunk. Right? We're talking basically about his state of drunkenness. Had it begun? Had it begun before? Was it about to begin? Had it already begun or coming towards the end? Had we already passed the end? Okay, that's what these forms do in some sense. Okay. And then notice, and this is kind of crucial, is that these forms exhibit that same semantic, they exhibit the same kind of characteristics of what's known semantically as a dual group. If we swap the adjective with its antonym, the opposite operator holds true. So, for example, he is still young is semantically equivalent to he is not yet old. Okay, so sometimes you only need 2 of these operators. You don't need 4, right? She has already left. She is no longer here. Okay? Okay. So now what we're interested in doing is basically taking these 2 dual groups, one which is sensitive to kind of moments on a temporal scale, and one which is sensitive to degrees on an intensity scale, and we see that they frequently co-occur. And because they co-occur, you realize they're independent dimensions, right? And so that means you can set up, in some sense, a 4x4 space of possibility for judgments relating temporality to intensity. Okay, and what I want to do now is just explore that space a little bit. Okay. So let me just go to those 3 utterances again, just to remind you. So at the end of July, there was no longer enough food for all the people. Despite the evidence they had seen, they were not yet angry enough to take a stand. When they finally began to act, it was already too damaged to make a difference. I'll spend most of my time, I'm going to be mainly talking about kind of this last utterance, but the other 2 fit in. Okay. And so I'm going to do a little bit of review now, because I kind of went through a few technical things quickly. And then after this little bit of review, I'll get into, in some sense, the key thing we're interested in, this 4x4 space. But to begin with, I just want to note one thing. There's a background to the, I'm just going to read you 2 pages now to give you kind of a sense of my writing voice rather than my yakking voice, which is what we've had to hear so far. Hopefully it's a little bit more pleasant. But sometimes what I want to do is I read you this thing, because what it's fundamentally about is in some sense the topological nature of these categories. And I don't know anything about topology per se, it's a big word, but when I talk to my mathematician friends, they tell me that what you mean by topology, it's a certain branch of mathematics that studies, in some sense, certain types of variations, and these things that remain invariant across the variations. And the classic example they give you is that a topologist, and this is good for the food talk, a topologist is someone who can't tell the difference between a donut and a coffee mug. Because a donut can be continuously transformed into a coffee mug while holding invariant the kind of key features of that object, geometrically speaking, that a mathematician might be interested in. Okay, I'm interested here in kind of topology of these semantic categories. How something can vary them dramatically, but something remains invariant. Okay? And if you don't like, donuts and coffee mugs, you can use bagels and beer and tones. Because similar things hold. Okay. So while these 3 judgments involve very different lexical contents, they express very similar grammatical patterns. Taken together as a poem as much as a prophecy, they thereby evince the kind of invariance under variation that is a hallmark of topological inquiry. So each of these judgments, as just reviewed, involves 3 events located at various points in time. If we focus on the 3rd judgment, there is the time the judgment was made, the speech event, the time someone began to act, the reference event, and the time something was too damaged to make a difference, the narrated event. Focusing on the 2nd clause of this 3rd judgment, the referent of it is the figure, say the planet Earth, itself the ground for an infinity of other figures, and as far as we know, all figurations. The referent of damaged is the dimension, some generalized notion of harm or degradation as applicable to the figure that can occur to various degrees and hence with greater or lesser intensity. An adverb like to indicates that the degree of the dimension at issue for the figure in question is outside of some acceptable range. Crucially, such a range of acceptability is dependent not just on the figure and dimension in question, but also on the stance of the speaker and the standards of some collectivity, right? Where such standards and stances are themselves dependent on some causal model of the world and or some intensity imaginary, more generally. An adverb like already, as it occurs in the 2nd clause, indicates that the onset of too much damage occurred before the time of action. Such an adverb then relates the reference event and the narrated event, onset or offset, before or after, just like the tense or modality of the first clause relates the speech event and the reference event, as earlier or later, or even actual versus counterfactual. So we might diagram the kind of space as follows. So this is where you dip your French fries. Okay. So, as I said, you have in some sense two semantic spaces. One kind of carried out by the not enough, the enough, the not to, or the to, and that's in some sense the generalized dimension of intensity. That's orthogonal to, but frequently co-occurring with, members of this other set, which in some sense can be aligned along moments of time en route to some E sub j. And you can guess what E sub j stands for. Okay. And then here is in some sense the acceptability range that we talked about. And you're not like below the acceptability range, within the acceptability range, but on the low side, within the acceptability range, but on the high side, or outside of the acceptability range. Okay? And then here, in some sense, this is also a little kind of key threshold within which the narrated event was true. And this is in some sense moments of time before then, the time when it had become true, the time when it was still true, and the time it was no longer true. And then everything within this swatch here, the sweet or sour swatch, is things that are in some sense true and within the acceptability range at the same time. And as you can see, there's in some sense 4 by 4 places you could be in this space, right? It has 16 spaces, and that third utterance that we were looking at, we say now in some speech event, when they finally began to, it was already too damaged to, that's kind of located right about here in this space. Okay, and X marks the spot. Okay. So figure 1 shows a salient portion of the possibility space of such judgments, and is thus applicable to a wide range of figures, dimensions, events, standards, stances, collectivities, models, and imaginaries. Indeed, somewhat eerily, across this incredibly wide range of possibly possible worlds, while such a diagram might be stretched and strained indefinitely, much like a rubber sheet, right? Another kind of key metaphorical image of topology. The overarching relations between relations showcased within it remain relatively invariant. The vertical axis shows the degree of some dimension, or the intensity of some phenomenon, from lesser to greater. The thicker part, just a review of the vertical axis, indicates those degrees of the dimension at issue that are within an acceptable range for the figure in question. The horizontal axis shows moments in time from earlier to later. The thicker part of the horizontal axis indicates those moments of time when the judgment is being treated as true. Some figure has a certain degree of some dimension as located in relation to an acceptable range. Depending on where the reference event falls along this axis, the adverbs shown on the bottom of the horizontal axis are differentially applicable. Black circles denote critical thresholds, either temporal on the horizontal axis or intensive along the vertical axis. It should be clear that, or it should be stated that not all 16 4x4 possible judgments exist for all dimensions, for all figures, for all moments. For example, there are many today who would claim that you can be too rich. And predications like no longer dead only make sense in a world where resurrections are possible or zombies are actual. So precisely what constrains this possibility space is an open, labile, and somewhat unsettling question. I haven't explored it. This is kind of a hypothesis of something to explore the next time I go into the field. It's actually kind of half-baked as it is, so don't poke too hard because it will. Okay. So while the possibility space of such judgments is here being explicated in terms of linguistic categories, and in linguistic categories that have pretty good cross-linguistic, they show up again and again and again across languages precisely because they encode this very interesting dual group in some sense. Similar interpretive grounds arguably exist outside of language per se, as affective attunements, right? As ingenomed instincts, as ethical standards, as embodied practices, as institutional arrangements, as infrastructural layouts, as design features, as ecological feedback mechanisms, and as kind of encoded in computational algorithms. So for example, what is too high a temperature for a coral reef? Not enough promise for a speculative investment. Too steep a slope for a wheelchair ramp. Not enough hunger for a humanitarian intervention. Okay, these are the acceptability ranges with these temporal thresholds I'm interested in. I've done it in terms of language, but you don't have to. Okay. Dimensions, figures, acceptability ranges, truth conditions, and so forth are wide and far-reaching. In some sense, each collectivity and each individual within such a collectivity may have a different ensemble. Part of what it means to belong to a collectivity is to take up residence in such a space and to represent the spaces that other collectivities reside in. Indeed, no small part of one's identity is one's imaginary of acceptable degrees for various dimensions. For example, what kinds of subjects believe that it is still too early to tell, or feel that it is already too late to act? And what are the conditions of possibility for such modes of subjectivity? As an aside, it should be noted that our judgments are not just sensitive to thresholds within such imaginaries, they can also function to set such thresholds. Moreover, such judgments not only conform to the world, they also transform the world, potentially, right? Perturbing it in ways that can cause it to become both more and less iconic to their own contents. That said, now I'll end this little piece, we'll go into a quick conclusion when we're done. That said, the Earth itself will set, or has set, certain essential dimensions, some might say. Acceptability ranges and or reference events. To some degree, along certain key dimensions, it is arguably indifferent to our collective imaginaries. Indeed, some say that it is not just subject to our judgments, it is also a kind of ultimate agent, right? That which will one day judge, if it hasn't done so already, the soundness of our judgments, as to, in some sense, what resides within this acceptable range. Okay, so that's the conclusion in some sense, but I have just a tiny little epilogue and then we're done. Okay. So let's go back to those two examples I began with, one involving taboos concerning women's behavior around brooding hens, and to that little interaction between Trump and Kim Jong-un. Okay. So some of you who actually read the newspaper, you realize that wasn't exactly how it all went down. And I'm not exactly sure how it all went down, but I did some Googling over the weekend to kind of find out what really happened. And as far as I can make out, this is sort of how it went down. Kim Jong-un, in his New Year's address, said this: "The entire area of the US mainland is within our nuclear strike range. The United States can never start a war against me and our country." Note that pronominal shift, maybe. And Donald Trump, kind of in response to that message, said, will someone from his depleted and food-starved regime, I had no idea this was about food until this weekend, actually, please inform him that I too have a nuclear button, but it is much bigger and more powerful than his, and my button works. Okay. And then the North Korea state-run media, in response to his tweet, said it is a spasm of a lunatic. Okay. So then all of that then kind of got baked into, it was reported by various media outlets, and the kind of gist of many of them was first they tried to offer kind of like what went down in this exchange, and they said something like Trump taunts Kim that my nuclear button is much bigger than yours, and then what went down in this exchange, North Korea scoffs at Trump's nuclear button tweets. We moved to taunting and scoffing, needless to say. And then by the time it got to my informants, he was probably getting his information as hearsay from someone who had heard it on the radio from someone who had read it in the Spanish press. And so this is what we got, when we talked about at the very beginning of today's talk. Trump said, I have a button, mine is very big, I will press it and I will kill you all. The other said, I too have a button, mine is much bigger than yours, I will push it and I will kill you, singular. Okay, so this was his, in some sense, far down interpretant of all that stuff that had happened before. And you kind of see partly the radical kind of poetic figuration that occurs here, the radical kind of contextualization that occurs there, and a range of other things you can kind of push on if you're interested in it. Okay. And then, of course, there's my interpretant of this whole thing, because I was getting my information, my news from the speaker, which is like, what the heck is going on in the world? I should really call home. So let me just conclude on this then by just noting a couple things of this last exchange. And then this is it. So by the time this exchange got to the man I was speaking with, the events were radically changed, with Kim speaking rather than the state media, and Kim in some sense getting the last laugh, and rather than them simply, and them simply speaking rather than taunting and scoffing. Note that Trump's most barbed insult was really about North Korea being a depleted and food-starved regime. Note that, at least in the catchy speakers report, Kim and Trump were playing a form of chicken, and at least one of them is certainly a hawk, probably both of them. With respect to those modal indefinite quantities, note that a key issue for Kim is that his missiles can now travel far enough, right? In some sense, the US is now within the acceptability range. For Trump, it's basically what is far enough for you is too far for me, okay? It's now the US is within your range, and other things with really going on in Trump's mind besides this. But in some sense, the thing is set up as two different agents. The relationship gets figured between two radically different stances on the same degree, right? One is close enough, one is too close, one is far enough, right? And then finally, in this, I don't study politics, I don't study Trump, I don't study any of these things, but just kind of simply stated, both leaders were widely lambasted as going way too far in terms of provocation, in terms of outside the boundaries of acceptable presidential demeanor or even polite decorum. Right? So there's another sense in these things have gone too far here. And then finally, note that just as chickens bear undue responsibility for their actions as their owners, citizens bear way too much responsibility for the actions and utterances of their sovereigns. And so it should be taboo, I just figured this out, for sovereigns to engage in such behaviors, but alas, it is no longer. Okay, thank you.
We have time for questions. If anybody would like to volunteer a question? Yes, great, go ahead.
Great talk, Paul. I really enjoyed it. I'm curious to follow up on the idea of stuff that's outside of radical structure and language and so forth. And I'm curious about that kind of sweet spot in there, so to speak, or the ground, what the relationship might be for affective responses and bodily responses. Because I think what you're demonstrating this last segment here is the way in which the kind of interpretive frame of language can make something appear to be too much or too little depending upon your starting point. Okay, so it creates a possibility of variability in the scheme. The question of something like the embodied response to too salty or too sweet, something like that. That seems to me to center on something that maybe is a kind of universal core, as you were talking about these comparative frameworks. So I'm wondering, how you see that. Is the variability something that's imposed by linguistic structure, discourse, signs, or is it present also, and in what measure, in those kind of affects that fall beneath the level, so to speak, of reflective grammatical structure of discourse and metascience and so forth. See what I'm getting at?
Yes. So I don't have a good answer to that. It's a super question. I need to think through that sort of thing. I can kind of sneak up on it in certain ways. It might at least be for the sake of continuing the conversation. But so one thing I was thinking about in terms of acceptability ranges, certainly, and I'm not a biologist, so just take all this with a grain of salt. You have things like, pH balance has to be within a certain range, or catastrophic things happen in the organism. Right? You have things like temperature has to be within a certain range, or catastrophic things happen to the organism, or the iceberg, or the ecosystem more generally. So I think in some sense you can talk about ways in which biologically we have evolved to, in some sense, inhabit and kind of make sure that we consistently have a certain acceptable range. But otherwise, drastic things happen to our cell structure and so forth. So I think there's a way in which, if you want, you can push these things are, in some sense, you can study them as a chemist or a biologist or an archaeologist or biological anthropologist in terms other than kind of cultural framing and social construction. I think that's it. I do think, too, that one of the things I want to get at here is, even though, just cross-linguistically for a second, you can, what counts as too salty, maybe that range can vary widely. But the idea that there is an acceptability range with a lower threshold and an upper threshold, I think you'll find that again and again. So that's what I mean by that stretching ability. So that, in some sense, those upper threshold and that lower threshold for a dimension, you can do all sorts of things like this with it in a collectivity over history or across collectivities. But in some sense, that remains invariant, that little relationship between relations. And so part of what I'm trying to get at is what remains invariant plus all that variation. But then I think the other thing you said is quite interesting is you think about like, what does it mean to, in some sense, for some, someone's behavior outside of me to, in some sense, go too far? Like, what does it mean? Like, oh, you said something that went too far, or it didn't go far enough. And I do think it comes out in the Trump case, but also more generally, different theories of the self. So William James' theory of the self, we think about, okay, my self kind of can wax or wane, wane or wax as a function of good or bad things happen to me. And as a function of me being aware of them, either overtly or relatively unconsciously. Dogs have selves and chickens have selves for William James as much as humans. And then you can sometimes talk about the ways in which an organism is sensitive to the waxing and waning of the self, including just like what happened to my chicks, what happened to my good name, what happened to my reputation, what happened to my foot that's caught in a trap, these sorts of things. And in some sense, when has something too much happened to myself and too much along a negative dimension, such that various moods of affect can kick in. And I don't have anything to say that's particularly knowledgeable about where those are in some biological way, but I could imagine someone might study them in a kind of interesting way.
Hi Paul, great talk as usual. I was wondering about an issue that you didn't touch upon, but which is somehow in the background of some of your observations, which is that, when lots of people talk about gradients and things like that, for example, Kennedy and the people in the form semantic stuff, right, they're able to identify various boundaries of an upper or lower kind or and so forth, having to do with adverbs and other kinds of operators that imply, in contextualized use, that there has to be a reference standard against which the deployment of these actually works, right? So going back to one of your earlier slides, you laid out for each of those operators, you laid out several things that are specific to that form or set of forms, and then you talked about various other things that are part of the context that will shape the deployment of these forms, right? Now, across this entire range of exemplification, and all of these illustrations that you've given us, whether it have to do with a household minding its chickens or a sovereign minding its triggers, so to speak, right? There is the actual use of these types of categories depends upon the existence of reference standards of various kinds, right? Which would make their use repeatable. One could do it more than once, or intelligible to someone one is talking to, and so on and so forth. So my question is, with respect to the kinds of things you're looking at in Kekchi, is there an ethnographic project that you see at some point in the future, but that you perhaps haven't done yet, to try to uncover what are, leaving sovereign and triggers aside, but focusing really just on the concerns of these people in this locale, right? What are some of the metrics which provide a frame of reference within which using gradients and using these indefinite quantity expressions and so forth is repeatable, is intelligible, and so on and so forth. So that's an open-ended question. I realize it's taking us beyond the lovely domain that you've already covered in this talk, but I wondered if you have any thoughts about that question.
So it's a very great question, and the key thing that got me interested in this, I in some sense explored in non-linguistic ways in that book, The Chicken and the Quetzal. And what I was interested in there is in some sense, so a key thing for them is labor pool around agricultural tasks of one sort or another. And a key thing is that kind of men, especially during certain parts of the agricultural harvest, they basically exchange labor. You work for me, I'll work for you. But a crucial thing is if I can't work for you after you've worked for me, who can I send in my stead? And so the key thing that happens is there are all sorts of arguments of when is a boy old enough or not yet old enough to stand in for his father in a labor pool. And or when can a woman ever stand in for her husband in a labor pool and what kind of labor? So the key place where I really saw these expressions first off were literally kind of places where you were kind of age-ranking boys as a function of different kinds of local notions of competence that they would have, such that they could substitute for their father or not, depending on the task at hand. And in that sort of place, you see, it's not like the chick versus rooster case. I think most people here would agree that 2 or 3 roosters is quite a lot. And you need 50 chicks to be very many. So there's that kind of standard that's set. But in cases like labor pooling, there were lots of talks about exactly when it was. And these things got pegged to typically a quantificational scale along age. So 14, not enough. 15, still not enough. 16, enough, and older. And then women couldn't even get on that scale to begin with in some sense. They could not have their degrees aligned on the same dimension. They were incommensurable with respect to this. It's not like they're more or less, it's just like, why would you ask that question? How could it make sense in this context? And it was only in the context of things like an eco-tourist industry that started to come in, where new types of labor occurred, where women could substitute for their husbands. And hence, kind of radical transformations happened with respect to partly grading people with respect to the kinds of competences that they needed to have to engage in different types of labor. And with new labor regimes, new competences, all of a sudden women and men could be aligned on the same axis, and all of a sudden labor could be given for cash rather than barter in a labor pool. So a lot of things started to happen. And one of the key things that started to happen though is boom, as soon as you become commensurable, boom, all of a sudden definite quantity enters in, and not just indefinite quantity. And all that, all the shit that starts to happen in some sense. So thank you for that question. So that would be one place. I don't know if that's...
No, that's wonderful. That's a wonderful and very vivid example because as obviously you also can see, and have already been thinking about this, that this set of issues opens up a way of exploring a whole range of such tacit and unexamined and undescribed frameworks of reference standards of various kinds, through which much of what happens in social life unfolds. And it strikes me that the labor example is very nice because that helps us see that in fact this issue is extendable to almost any domain of experience in which lots of people have to interact with respect to something, some phenomenon.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Yes, Christina.
Thank you for the wonderful talk. One of the things that was interesting is the choice of the adjective sweet or the nominalized form of sweetness, because those are very anthropologically rich words. And I'm thinking, on the one hand, of Sidney Mintz, Sweetness and Power, and the way sweetness can undergo historical shifts in response to power and colonialism. On the other hand, the literature on qualia. And I think that this is really interesting in the way that it gives us a different way to approach some of these questions or show the mechanisms under which. So I wonder if you could maybe talk about why sweetness in this context and also how maybe this research might give insight into those kinds of lines of thought.
Okay, no, good question. I fear I might be walking into a minefield by answering this question in a certain way. And so in some sense I'll tend to walk outside of that range as much as I can. One thing, this has nothing to do with sweetness. I don't think about sweetness per se. I just knew it would get some anthropological attention because of this. But I don't have anything to say about it per se. I haven't studied it in kind of among the Kekchi in a sophisticated way or systematic way, nor the use of the words per se. So sorry for that. But I do think your point being that in some sense, yes, these acceptability ranges, like it counts as too sweet, not sweet enough, absolutely mediated by things like the colonial encounter, for example. The cheapness of certain kinds of sugar and so forth. In some sense, so you should think of, I've been kind of giving a linguistic point of view plus a little bit of ethnographic point of view, but you could absolutely look at how acceptability ranges transform. coupled to what? With what effects? Totally interesting question. And I think a really interesting place to do it would be to study something like sugar and kind of what happened during that encounter and how people's taste got radically transformed. And in some sense, what's nice about it is you can couple it to not just kind of senses of what's too sweet or too sour, but what is unjust versus just, what's acceptable behavior or treatment of others versus unacceptable behavior. So that dimensions can go from food to any other dimension you want, like what's too much exploitation, right, and so forth. And it'd be very interesting to see the coupling of those. I haven't done it, I couldn't, but I think it's certainly a really interesting thing to do, and maybe reread that literature in this context. With respect to qualia, so the way I kind of think about it here is I think a large portion of the literature on qualia is essentially focused on adjectives. And kind of what do adjectives do. But without really studying adjectives as adjectives with these kind of really interesting grammatical distributions, kind of covert reactances as to what sorts of figures they can occur with, what sorts of operators they can occur with, and so forth. And I think a lot of the qualia literature kind of punts on, it's just basically talking about, we're not talking about qualia at all, we're talking about adjectives that refer to qualia. I think an interesting project could be set up in which you do in some sense a really careful grammatical and lexical account of those adjectives, qua adjectives, simultaneously with a kind of real careful phenomenological investigation of the reference of those adjectives in the sense of like, what is sweetness, if you really kind of want to work through it, what is, and how do I kind of want to make sense of sensuousness per se, and particularly the ways in which kind of sensual qualities are coupled with instigatory actions, right? So for example, one of the key ways to think about qualia is not like, well, it's a quality and it impinges upon me, but qualias are actually things that are coupled to actions. As I do something, qualias become more or less intense. And when you really want to think about what something like an adjective is, even like the reference of a word like red, it's probably not like redness. It's probably a systematic kind of invariance that basically holds forth across a wide degree of variations between actions I do and the sensory input, the sensory output, the sensory inputs I get as a function of what I've done. Things like colors exist at a kind of sensation, instigation, and variance. That's how I would go about studying these qualities. And then sandwich the two things together, I think something interesting would come up there. But I think the literature on qualia doesn't do that. They just punt to. They think they're getting at qualia, they're really getting at adjectives, but they're just talking about adjectives. So that would be my 2-cent critique. And also I'm interested in quantity as opposed to qualia, which is precisely that's a relative intensity of these things, rather than redness per se. But thank you for that question.
So you've written extensively about what you call the poetics of channels and the secrets of infrastructure, trying to bring Jacobson back into poetics, but also gesturing in some of Peter's work on secrets, right? Where reiterative moving through some space gives you a sense of all the possible substitutions and combinations of paths, right? Which then give you, in turn, a sense of the underlying organization of the sense-making system itself. Right, this is the whole poetics of channels, secrets of infrastructure thing. Given the focus on thresholds here, what would a poetics of thresholds look like, and how do acceptability ranges come to shift over space and time, particularly movement through space or migration, right? And this might key to some of Asif's earlier questions about tracing this out ethnographically. So yeah, what would a poetics of thresholds look like?
So I guess, so poetics is a kind of a wide term that can mean lots of things, but probably we both come from a tradition where poetics is used in a really narrow sense, in some sense, the repetition of tokens of a common type, as per like Roman Jacobson, or the projection of the axis of selection onto the axis of combination. So I take a paradigm and I float those onto a syntagm, such that like I scream, you scream, we all scream for ice cream is a poem, and this sort of thing. And I think if you really look at the essence of Jacobson's insight there, it might be glossed as this. Let or be and. Right? Two possibility spaces, kind of an or, combine them together with an and. Or if you kind of think about circuits, rather than anything that was in parallel, let it be in series. Okay, and I think that's one of the reasons why the Jacobsonian formulation of poetics is so kind of powerful, is it precisely gets at these two logical operators, and so it's magically transforming one into the other. And the second you do that, in some sense, you lay out in kind of phenomenological time what the kind of structure or set of regularities or set of virtual possibilities is that kind of on that virtual axis. So just to back, that was just to back up. So if you think about with respect to what I'm doing here, it should be noted that just about every example I gave you was poetic parallelism from the get-go. Like everything I did, starting with this, right? This line is in some sense a token of a type, and this line is a token of that same type. Abstractly speaking, this is a kind of token of a type, this is a token of that same type, abstractly speaking. So in some sense I was precisely looking at the kind of poetic framing of these things, and hence then I can think about what it means for a woman to walk, just to go for a walk, versus a chimp to go very far. Or in the case of the Donald Trump one, again, I laid it out as poetic structure, right? This kind of Trump said is a token of the common type, the other one said, and every statement at first. And so partly I think one way to get at these kinds of thresholds is I didn't cherry pick these, this is just how they talk. In some sense, I diagram it a certain way, but in some sense there's this kind of structure built into it. And so a large chunk of what I do then is compare and contrast a construction like this with a construction like this, precisely because they both show up in more or less the same context. And then I can think about why is qual different from mas, for example. They're tokens of the common type, but they're not the same token. They're different tokens. How do they systematically change? Or how does an explicit comparative relate to an implicit comparative? Mine is very big in comparison to yours versus mine is very big. So this thing. But then to get to the modal indefinite quantities, I'll give you one example of that kind of. But here's another. Here's another one where in some sense you get this kind of nice poetic figuration between two times, tokens of the type time, tokens of the type interjection, tokens of the type indefinite quantity, one being a really indefinite quantity and the other one not being, both referring to the same axis of time. So part of what I've been doing to try to get at these intensity thresholds is to use this kind of ever-present poetic parallelism to in some sense suss out what are salient types for speakers of Kekchi, rather than coming in and telling them, or kind of finding what types I'm interested in the first place. I'm looking at the ways in which they kind of poetically show me what the key types are. I don't know if that's where you're going.
Well, I was thinking the way you troped on poetics to talk about infrastructure, right, and channels. And I was wondering if you could do a similar thing beyond poetic parallelism to think about thresholds.
I do that, okay. Sorry.
Channels are also populated by thresholds.
Well, so here's how, let me talk about a very particular sort of infrastructure, because partly, and this maybe goes back to Austin's question a little bit, again, is kind of what's the ethnographic context for this, and some of it is this work with speakers of Kekchi Maya, but another thing I'm quite interested in is machine learning algorithms. And in some sense, algorithms are basically little paths through code space that basically get followed. Right? And so in some sense, even though they're written in code, they're basically following like a pattern. And so the distinction between code and channel, or mapping between signifiers and signifies versus a mapping between signers and interpretants, they get basically conflated with each other to a certain degree. And in the case of machine learning, a key thing people are looking at is they want to say, is this algorithm in some sense, they spend a lot of time tweaking what are called the hyperparameters of different algorithms. And they want to say, like, if I change the learning rate by a little bit, will this speed up the program, but will I lose accuracy? Or if I take a larger batch of data and make it really slow, but then we'll have far greater precision. And so the key thing they do is, in some sense, they tweak these hyperparameters to get the algorithm within an acceptable range. And the crucial thing is not everyone has a whole lot. It's very hard to know exactly how tweaking the hyperparameter will change the behavior of the algorithm. But if you get it within the acceptable range, it's like, oh yeah, this is fast and it's precise. And so they spend a lot of time almost magically changing hyperparameters such that this thing goes through this sense of path as a kind of computational infrastructure at the right enough rate and gets at the right destination for them. Right? In some sense, this is a good encoding for this data. So that might be another place to look at it. The other one I gave you was, in some sense, it came from my sister, who's a civil engineer. And she spends, one of the things she did kind of early in her career was, in some sense, design architecture for people with disabilities. And in those contexts, all she's working on is infrastructure, things like wheelchair ramps. And one of the things they give you is, okay, if you want to build a wheelchair ramp in the state of Texas, its slope has to be within a certain acceptable range, right? And so you get, in some sense, dictated acceptability ranges for things like coefficient of friction, slope, width, degree of covering, and so forth. And so all this, like, oh my God, the entire kind of standards for a civil engineer is all these legalized acceptability ranges, and you have to build within them. At the end of the day, you're judged as did you go outside of it or not, and you get another contract as a function of that. So that's another place where, in some sense, infrastructure, in the very concrete sense, is radically tied to acceptability ranges of this sort. I would have to think about it as poetics more, but anyways, thank you for that question.
I have a question about this concept of dual group and the sort of comparability that you talked about with them, particularly because the examples that you gave, a lot of them are things that sort of are not morally loaded. So something that is salty, that could be a good thing or a bad thing. Something that's sweet could be a good thing or a bad thing. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that might work in the concept of like good versus evil. Because to me, something that is like not good enough is not the same thing as too evil in terms of what it means in my head. And so I'm wondering, like, if you can, in terms of those things being like, very equivalent structures, and I know that's a very specific example, but in terms of how we utilize them, I feel like it would be interesting to think through that.
Great question. Well, so I agree. You could probably go back to Nietzsche for the definitive account of this. The difference between good and evil, they're not antonyms in any. And lots of these words like good or equality or something like this, they typically pull out multiple dimensions. And it's very context specific what dimension you're actually talking about with respect to good. The food is good, the setting is good, the lighting is good, the crowd is good. Like, John's not very good. This way, so I take that. That's a great. And so those would be some of the those would be actually kind of semantic tests you could do. Do I get? Is this equivalent to that? The two examples you gave, and no, it says, oh my God, good versus evil. Those don't count antonyms in this context. And so that would be a very interesting. Those would be in some sense the sort of tests you might do with a linguist who'd actually worked with these systematically to, in some sense, see whether this pans out or doesn't. And that's a great example of it. I do think, and in other cases, I haven't systematically, in some sense, studied talk about or interaction with respect to dimensions that might be so morally or ethically loaded. But I think that would be a superb kind of direction to take this and say, when we talk about two and enough, what does that mean in the context of justice? What does that mean about not just environmental degradation, but just forms of anti-humanism, criminality, and other sorts of things. I haven't done it, but I think it's, and whether in some when you go to those extreme cases, maybe some of the semantics kind of trips up over itself. It can't handle it. It's kind of used to the unmarked talking about sweetness and sourness, but you go in this other direction, and I think that's a fair. I tried to, get a little bit of this, kind of thinking at what does it mean to say my missiles can go far enough versus for me to say missiles go too far. And the kind of, it has huge implications at the end of it, though it's just phrased as near and far in the same way chickens and chicken hawks were. And so it's a kind of interesting way in which an adjective that can be doing one work in the context of chicken talk can mean something radically different and more pronounced and perhaps scary in the context of nuclear weapons and so forth. But great question, I need to look into that.
Okay, sure. You get the last question.
Oh, great. Thanks again for your talk. It was really fascinating. I was really intrigued and would like to hear you speak a little bit more about material thresholds. You talked a little bit about materiality as like a kind of ultimate interpretation, that like at the end of the day, very briefly, that like judges. Sorry?
Did I say at the end of the day?
Oh, well, no, I don't think you did.
Okay, no, it sounds very in the last instance.
But you know, but there's kind of something that's going to judge us. I guess.
Oh, yeah, okay.
I don't know if you use that phrase, but you know, we sometimes do like reference the material world as a kind of comparative grounds in phrases like it's, you know, in January it's cold enough to kill us, or maybe even it's so cold that like people are dying. But like materiality here is almost kind of like a specter that's really, really hard to get at ethnographically. That's like it's there, it's in those comparisons. But I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about like how do we approach like material thresholds with respect to these other kinds of thresholds that you've been discussing that we have.
So like I went too far. I mean, it seemed pretty clean cut in that case. Precisely when I went too far. Because I said, in some sense, there's a pretty thickly determined acceptability range in that sort of case. But you can imagine, in some sense, what humans are really good at. And you want to think of like what's another term for media? It's buffers, right? And we kind of buffer ourselves against all these so-called real thresholds in all sorts of ways. One of the ways we do it is we wear coats when it's cold, sweat when it's hot, find cold water and so forth. So there's one thing human beings is really good at. It's in some sense finding ways to buffer all these acceptability ranges, right? That would otherwise kind of constrain us in sorts of ways. So in this case, I could put knee pads on and skateboard or whatever, and pull that off as a trick rather than a mistake. So I guess there's a piece of me which would say, the interesting question here is not like what is the fixed line per se, but what is some collectivity's sense of where the fixed line is? What is another collectivity's sense of where the fixed line is? What are the kinds of disagreements? What are the conditions of possibility for two different accounts of where the hard and fast line is? And I think that's a kind of interesting question, absolutely. Another kind of interesting question is what you might call kind of semiotic strain. The sense in which I think, oh no, the wall starts there. And you're like, no, it doesn't. I'm like, yeah, it does. And you can, in some sense, the ways in which I can, in some sense, act as if the wall starts here, or act as if the wall doesn't start here. And so then the question becomes like, what are the signs that I am crossing a threshold without realizing it? What counts as a symptom of me over having stepped a boundary? Yet simultaneously, I'll deny the boundary, and yet I'm engaging in some kind of behavior that basically makes it look like, oh no, he just stepped over a boundary. What are the conditions of possibility for that strain between my sense of where a threshold exists and where a threshold actually exists, so to speak? And I'm not interested so much in where it actually exists, but I'd certainly be interested in the kind of modes of strain or symptoms that arise at that tacitly overcrossing of a boundary that something says is there to some degree. Or I'd be interested in the conflicts between two people who have radically different understandings of where it belongs. What are the conditions of possibilities for them to so radically differentially represent where the acceptability range is? That's an interesting question. And then I would, put some faith in biology and thermodynamics and climate science and other things that basically say, no, here are some hard and fast thresholds. And some of them I think are looking at things like pH balance and temperature range and other sorts of things, versus like what is the critical temperature, what is the critical CO2 level, these sorts of things. And it's what are the conditions of possibility for this to be promulgated as the place? What are the counter arguments? And kind of what are all the conflicts that arise at that intersection? But I would still give the Earth the final word. And then you ask me what E sub j means, which is the far right at the bottom. And my sense is it could mean E sub Jacobson. But otherwise, I like E sub the judgment event or the Jubilee event, depending on how pessimistic or optimistic or otherworldly you incline.
Thank you so much.